Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Tactics Board. There is a bit of momentum behind Norwich City now after 2 wins on the spin and with a run of fixtures that they will feel they have a good chance of winning. That starts this weekend when Derby County visit Carrow Road tomorrow, and here on Tactics Board I'm going to take a look at how the game will play out. First of all, I'll predict Johannes Hoff-Torup's starting 11. Then we'll take a little bit of a closer look at Derby's tactics and how they're likely to match up against the home side. And then I'm going to come on to transfers, which I know we all love to talk about. And I'm going to delve into the tactical impacts that those new deadline day signings could make on the team. But we're going to start with that predicted 11. So without further ado, here it is. So I've gone for Angus Gunn in goal, Kellen Fisher at right back, Shane Duffy and Callum Doyle in the centre of defence, with Lucian Mahovo at left back, Kenny McLean, Oscar Schwartau and Emiliano Marcondes in midfield, with Ante Cianats on the right, Lewis Dobbin on the left and Josh Sargent through the middle up front. Now, there are a few positions which feel nailed on, and I think after a couple of successive victories, some really good patterns of play in those games as well, especially against Watford, of course, against 10 men. But the sort of win that Norwich will be delighted to have ground out away from home against a side who are in and around them. And maybe a similar game in terms of the way that Norwich will expect to dominate and the fact that they'll want to and expect to be on the ball and trying to be a little bit more proactive in this game. Of course, that was the case against Swansea, but the 5-1 scoreline was sort of quite misleading in the end, and for most of the game it felt like actually the teams were kind of 50-50, but against Derby, who have really been struggling, and of course we'll come on to them, it feels like Norwich have a chance to dominate a little bit more, as they did for much of the game against Watford. So I think there are several positions that are pretty nailed on. Of course, that back four looks pretty solid at the moment. They look like they are a very cohesive unit. Angus Gunn in goal as well. Kenny McLean and Emiliano Marcondes, I think, have been fantastic and proven their worth. And on the left wing, Lewis Dobbin isn't obviously going to be replaced by Borja Sainz, who is going to be serving the final game of his 6-match suspension. And you've got Josh Sargent, who, when he is fit, starts for Norwich City. But I think in the midfield and in that right wing area, there are a couple of debates to have, really, and a lot of them revolve around Oscar Schwartau and the role that he plays. Of course, Torup has played him both in central midfield and out wide this season. Personally, I think he's looked better in the middle, and that's where Torup sees him long term. But he feels like right now, out wide is an easier position for him to get used to the Championship, for him to be involved in the way that Norwich play, and he's not sure he's quite ready for that central role on a consistent basis this season. But I think with the quality of the opposition, the fact that they will probably sit quite deep and allow Norwich to have some of the ball, there isn't going to be the same onus on taking the ball in tight areas from centre-backs and having to avoid an aggressive press. I think this is the sort of game where Schwartau probably still can get on the ball quite easily and face the play and try to create chances without being in that wide role, which, to be honest, doesn't look that natural. Yes, we see more of him on the ball and we see him more involved in that role, but generally what he does is just sort of drift into a central position, drift into a number 10 position, and then look for the sorts of passes that players in that role will look for. I don't think it's the most effective use of someone in that position, and when you look at the number of players now pushing for that role, it doesn't feel like using Schwartau there would be the best use of space. But in a game where Norwich will need as many creative players on the pitch as possible, they want to get those players in those number 10 positions and creating chances for Josh Sargent and the players around him. I think having Schwartau in a more central role will benefit them and will give them a little bit more purpose and a little bit more creativity in an attacking sense. And then out on the right, it allows them to have a technical player like Ante Cianats, who can get on the ball a little bit more, who can take players on, who can drift inside and try to maybe get shots on goal or link up with Josh Sargent. And then you've obviously got Mate Jurasek, who is able to play for the club for the first time. And before the press conference, and of course all of these things could change, we're expecting him to be on the bench and to play a role from there. So in that right wing area, it feels like there's quite a lot of competition, and maybe a little bit too much competition to have a sort of makeshift central midfield player out there at the moment. Of course, that would mean dropping Jakob Sorensen, and that will feel very harsh after a very good performance in my eyes against Watford. A lot of composure, looked pretty good defensively as well, and showed probably why Norwich haven't quite given up on him yet, despite the injury struggles. But in a game like this, I'm not sure you need someone like him and Kenny McLean in those midfield roles. I think McLean does the defensive bit enough, and then you have a little bit more creativity with the likes of Marcondes and Schwartau. But whatever Torup does with the team, it will be interesting to look at those positions when the team news drops at 2 p.m. tomorrow. On to Derby, and a team who actually started the season pretty well. Of course, when a club of that size comes back up to the Championship after a few years in League One, everyone assumes that it's going to be very easy for them and that they're going to acclimatise quickly and just almost go back to the club that they were before in the Championship. And it felt like that was what they were doing in the first few months. Their form at Pride Park was absolutely fantastic. They were pushing towards sort of mid-table, and they were quite clear of that relegation zone when these two teams last met in September. But you look at the quality of that squad, there are still quite a few League One quality players in there who maybe don't have many appearances at Championship level, and that does seem to have caught up with them and with Paul Warne. So right now they're really struggling. They've lost their last 8 games. Warne is under some serious pressure coming up against the team that he's very open in saying that he loves. I think he'll probably be desperate for a result to an extent that he won't really be thinking about Norwich too much in this one. But we know how he can set up a team, and actually we've seen it with Rotherham before, who have been in a similar circumstance, battling relegation under Warne. We've seen that they can come to Carrow Road and go firm and sit deep and sort of allow Norwich to come onto them without really conceding too many huge chances. They got a 0-0 draw at Carrow Road in 2023, I think in the spring period. So not too dissimilar to the situation that Derby are in coming into this one. And Warne will have his players very well organised. They'll be good from set pieces. They'll be solid, and the only way that Norwich really will be able to break them down is by moving the ball quickly, by baiting them in and then exploiting the space. And when we normally talk about that, it's from playing out from the back. It's Angus Gunn needing to hold his nerve and take his time. It's Shane Duffy and Callum Doyle doing that as well. But you feel that maybe Derby won't press quite as high in this one. It isn't something that they've done against some of the better sides this season. And of course, with the amount of momentum that Norwich have, you'd probably put them in that category. So that baiting will be more on the likes of McLean and Marcondes and Schwartau to take their time, to wait for the right pass to open up rather than trying to force things. Because if they're in loads of space in midfield, the Derby deep midfielders aren't even close to them. They're just shielding that back four. Then trying to fire passes into Josh Sargent or play balls in behind a very deep defence is going to be difficult. They need to bait them out. They need to create the space in behind them, and then hopefully find the likes of Marcondes, Schwartau, Dobbin, Sienats in almost number 10 positions to try to either take shots themselves or create the chances for Josh Sargent. Of course, we know that Sargent is capable of dropping a little bit deeper himself, and although he is a typical number 9, he likes to get on the ball on the edge of the area, take those shots on. So if they can create that space by passing the ball around quickly in midfield, baiting Derby into those challenges, then that's where the space will be for Norwich and where they can hurt the away side. But Derby definitely won't make it easy, and we've seen how well drilled a Paul Warne team can be before. Now, I wanted to finish with a little bit of a discussion about some of the players who Norwich have brought in and how they can impact the team tactically. Of course, we've talked about Anis Ben Slimane, Lewis Dobbin, Matej Jurasek, but on deadline day, Norwich signed Rory McConville from Brighton, and they signed Jacob Wright on loan from Manchester City with an option to make that deal permanent, potentially an obligation going into the end of the season. So a couple of very interesting additions, both of them 19, so they clearly fit into the younger profile. Maybe they aren't likely to play absolute frontline first team roles straight away, but they are players who will play into Johannes Torup's game model in future and certainly are recruited to play his philosophy. Both are good on the ball. McConville is quite physical to go along with that, has a good physical profile. Even for 19, he's got that ruggedness about his game, but mainly I think what will take the eye tactically to start off with will be his work on the ball. He's right-footed, he's right-sided, but he's confident with his weaker left foot as well. And he will look to play those passes out from the back. So in terms of the squad building and maybe the way that Norwich are trying to upgrade on the players they've currently got, I think we've all seen how good Shane Duffy has been defensively this season, but the idea in the long term will be to replace him with somebody who has those qualities and those aspects to their game, but maybe can add a little bit more quality in possession, can not only avoid mistakes, but can play proactive passes and create those opportunities. And of course, we've seen Duffy do that at times, but it is very much a risk-reward game, and probably he's made more mistakes than progressive passes and creating real chances for Norwich. So Norwich will want to improve that percentage. That's something they'll be working with Duffy on, but it does feel like McConville comes in as that right-sided long-term replacement maybe, with Duffy's deal up in just under 18 months and Norwich looking to build the future for the future. But he definitely looks like a sort of Johannes Hoff-Torp player. The same is true of Wright, who is very good in tight spaces, and you won't be surprised given the fact that he's come through the Manchester City Academy. But when I spoke about the midfielders needing to take the ball in tight spaces, like what Torp is hoping to teach Svartau to do in the long term, Wright is already pretty good at that. He's good at playing that Kenny McLean role where he'll take the ball from the defenders when they're trying to play out from the back. He's happy to do it with a number of midfielders around him and in a tight space. And the reason why that's so helpful, especially in that deeper midfield role, is that you don't need a situation like David Wagner had at the club where he was taking his deepest central midfielder, dropping him into the back line. And although that does get your better ball players onto it or into possession more easily, that means that they're sucked deeper into the pitch. It means that you don't have as many bodies in midfield and you can be outnumbered actually when it comes to the offensive areas where you really want to do that damage and you really want to have numeric superiority. But because you've dropped one of your key players into a defence, you've increased the numbers in the back line, it makes it harder to achieve that superiority higher up the pitch. But if Turk can have midfielders like Wright, who can take the ball in tight spaces, then they don't need to drop into that back line. They can take it in midfield. Norwich can advance the ball first of all, and they can have more bodies in those advanced areas to try to create those chances and create that superiority. But Wright also brings a defensive physicality. He's good positionally. He's got a decent amount of athleticism to him to get around and make those challenges and cover the defence. And of course, those are the qualities that Norwich fans have been hoping for several windows. So on paper, both signings look pretty good. Of course, football, as I've said a few times over the last few days, is played on grass, and we'll have to wait and see what sort of players they are in a yellow and green shirt. But certainly for now, these signs are good. Now, let's see what Norwich can produce against Derby this weekend. Hopefully, when I rejoin you on Tactics Board before next week's game against Preston, the feeling is very positive after a third win in a row. Thank you very much for joining me today. Pinkun.com/subscribe, the place to go if you haven't already, for all of our coverage from the weekend's game and plenty more. But yeah, thank you very much for joining me, and I'll see you again very soon.